From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Anne-Marie Hordern, I'm Joe Matthew.
$30 billion and 11 major banks, Bank of America, Citigroup, JP Chase, Wells Fargo, and more, all coming to the assistance of First Republic Bank, with JP Morgan's Jamie Dimon meeting with Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, today. We'll get reaction from Senator Chris Van Hollen, member of the Senate Banking Committee.
Speaking of Janet Yellen, she spent the morning in the hot seat on Capitol Hill following tumult in the banking sector in the U.S. and abroad.
I can reassure the members of the committee that our banking system is sound and that Americans can feel confident that their deposits will be there when they need them. This week's actions demonstrate our resolute commitment to ensure that our financial system remains strong and that depositors' savings remain safe.
We'll hear from Congressman Patrick McHenry, chair of the House Financial Services Committee, this hour.
And the U.S. government releases dramatic video saying that they say shows the moment a Russian jet dropped fuel on a U.S. drone, causing it to crash. We'll be discussing this in the political fallout with our panel. Joe, quickly, that video is incredible.
Nobody can stop watching it. It's the video of the day, using a fuel dump as a weapon.
And the Russians say we had nothing to do with this.
Sure.
This is their U.S. satellite. They fell out. But this video just goes to show that's likely very incorrect.
And we're never going to get that drone back again, according to John Kirby, a few hundred feet underwater here. Let's start with the news at hand, though, and Bloomberg's Washington bureau chief, Peggy Collins, is with us, and executive editor Michael Shepard. It's great to see both of you here on a breaking news day. Peggy, you've had a big one here, and I want to get to this arrangement that the Treasury has announced to essentially to rescue First Republic. But we've got red headlines on the terminal here. Banks rushing to the liquidity rescue. What's happening right now at the discount window?
So you're right, Joe. Two things collided in the last hour in the Bloomberg newsroom and elsewhere, where we had the announcement of several major U.S. banks swooping in to try to shore up First Republic, working in coordination with the U.S. Treasury. But then also we got figures that the number of banks who tapped the Fed facility that was created on Sunday to Wednesday of this week, those numbers are very, very big, showing that there was a lot of need in the system for liquidity.
$164.8 billion.
It's huge.
It's tremendous. The politics of all of this. Jamie Dimon, Wall Street banker, Janet Yellen having a meeting, banks bailing out banks. How does this play?
Well, it took Washington by surprise. This came upon the nation's capital very quickly, and they've had to respond with a speed that they're not accustomed to these days. And it's a situation that President Joe Biden wasn't exactly counting on when he took office. But he has tried to get his Treasury Secretary and also get other regulators on board with plans to stop all this, literally over the span of a week.
Peggy, I want to talk to you about the announcement from the Treasury. We just saw a statement from the chair of the Financial Services Committee, who we're going to hear from in just a moment, Patrick McHenry. Was this a government bailout, so to speak, or not? Because he's crediting the administration for not using taxpayer dollars, for instance. But this is a government-orchestrated deal.
Well, I think the Biden administration, as Mike was saying, has been working really hard to make sure that it isn't seen as a bailout and that taxpayer dollars are not being used to support some of these banks that are in trouble right now. But as we also saw from Yellen's testimony earlier today on the Hill, the government is trying to say to the American people, your deposits are safe, our banking system is strong. But the events of the last week, the speed of them, is causing the government to have to assure regular Americans. And that's not something we've seen in many years.
And what happens now? They must be worried about what's the next potential First Republic, SVB, Signature Bank.
Well, they're looking at this on a couple of different levels. One is the short-term question of what lies around the corner and what is the next crisis that they might have to respond to. But they're also taking a longer-term view, and that is where differences are starting to emerge very, very quickly. Populists in Washington, of course, hate the specter of any kind of a bank rescue here in Washington, but you very quickly see them part ways on what to do about it. Republicans are trying to blame woke capitalism for this. Democrats are saying it's time to maybe snap back into effect some of the regulations that were rolled back under President Donald Trump.
Janet Yellen on Capitol Hill today, as we discussed. I want to hear from her quickly. Grilled by the Senate Finance Committee at times about recent bank failures, here's what she had to say.
I think we certainly need to analyze carefully what happened that triggered these bank failures and re-examine our rules and supervision and make sure that they're appropriate to address the risks that banks face.
Peggy, how'd she do restoring, at least attempting to restore confidence in the banking sector?
Well, I think she was very forceful in saying that the Americans' deposits are safe. It was interesting, though, that a lot of the questions didn't revolve this morning around the safety of the banking system. Yeah, it was in terms of how quickly other things were happening in the sphere with Credit Suisse, where they were really struggling today. And that was one of the things that I found a bit surprising, that more of the banking hearing didn't revolve around the banking crisis we're seeing right now.
You mentioned this threshold, the $250,000 from the FDIC. Mike, do you think now Janet Yellen, the whole government, have they basically just set this precedent now? Is that going to be like one of the big debates happening?
That will be one of the big debates that we see unfold, and it could even become one of the political footballs in other battles, too, including over the debt ceiling, because it is something that they would have to negotiate over in terms of funding. One thing that did come up earlier in this week when we spoke to Sherrod Brown, he is not very optimistic at all about lasting fixes in terms of bank regulations getting through Congress. So it really will fall to regulators to have to do that. Back to the FDIC fund, though, that is something that they will have to take up, and it could be a real Donnybrook on Capitol Hill.
In the meantime, though, aren't we in this de facto scenario where, in fact, all deposits are being backed, are being insured?
Well, in a way, Joe, that's why we're seeing all this creativity, if you will, by the regulators to try to contain the crisis by coming up with these means literally almost overnight. We saw last weekend in Washington a number of them scrambling, leaving prestigious dinners or missing them altogether to make sure.
Right. Jay Powell missed your gridiron
That's
dinner.
That's right, he did. Missing these big events so that they could concentrate on the far bigger matter at hand. And so some of that creativity is happening now, but what is going to happen down the road? And that's when we start to have to look at the structural things that need to happen.
Peggy, you covered the Fed. What does this mean for them next week? How difficult is next week given this week?
This is really complicated, I have to say. I think that the Fed is trying to weigh a couple of things. Like, do they continue to crank up interest rates, even if it's just 25 basis points, in order to keep fighting inflation? We've still got those numbers of inflation that are way higher than the Fed wants them to be. But how do you do that at a time when Janet Yellen is on the Hill saying, don't worry, the banking system is safe? So there's obviously an issue out there. The other thing is that we are seeing credit tightening. We are seeing some financial conditions tighten in the market. So that may help the Fed in its ultimate goal. It's just not necessarily the way we all would have liked it.
Well, we spoke earlier today with Patrick McHenry, the chair of the House Financial Services Committee. Anne Marie and I started by asking him about the current banking situation, of course, but whether the changes made to the Dodd-Frank law in 2018 contributed to what happened.
Everybody's preaching their book. But that's not my responsibility. My responsibility is to get to the bottom of what happened and why. And that's my obligation as a committee chair, and to look into this matter and understand. What we know at this point is you have a couple of theories of the case. One, mismanagement. Obviously, the firm failed. Two, supervision, right? Whether or not those that were tasked with overseeing the bank in the regulatory sphere did the right thing. Third, regulation. Fourth, law. And then fifth is this macro question about the economy, the fiscal house that inflamed inflation, and then the Fed response to it and the rapid rising rates. So you have 5 buckets of theories at this point, and everyone has jumped to their natural conclusion to give the answer here. We have to first figure out why this happened and determine in a really quantitative and qualitative way what happened.
So you can't tell us now if the bill passed in 2018, in fact, was partly to blame, or maybe a better way to say is the original Dodd-Frank would not have prevented this from happening.
Well, the original Dodd-Frank and then the update in S-2155, the bipartisan bill that passed in 2018. The theory is, among some, is that changed it in such a substantial way, Dodd-Frank, that they could have seen it under the original law, but didn't see it because of the regulatory change. The first studies of this and the indication from bank analysts is that that's not the case. The liquidity cover ratio, this bank would have passed.
Should the Fed be investigating themselves? This is almost the third scandal under the Fed. There's the trading, there's the Kansas City, the Rare Masters account for the fintech firm, and now there's this. And the Vice Chair of Supervision, Michael Barr, will be investigating his own Fed. Why not have an outside probe? Well,
Congress will look into this, as we should. We created the Federal Reserve. Would you
be in favor of that? Like what Elizabeth Warren says, like an outside investigator?
Everyone in Washington wants to look around for an unbiased source of information, right? Good luck. Everybody has a perspective. We will certainly investigate this on Capitol Hill, and my committee will look into this. We have regional Fed challenges that we've seen, and you've marked three. This is the third example of it. We need to get to the bottom of how regional feds are operating, and whether or not we have to update the laws and constraints around those regional Federal Reserve boards and their leadership.
Mr. Chairman, should Congress pass a law that guarantees, that ensures all deposits? Because we seem to be in this de facto world where that is the case.
Well, there's a lot of debate about that. Now, what I want to understand are the knock-on effects if you do that. What does that do to the banking system long term? How does it change the allocation of capital? We have a vibrant economy in many respects because we have a diversity of lending options in the United States. I want to keep those diversity of lending options. I also want to keep the ability to fail in America because in a capitalist system, the inability to fail means that you don't actually prove out what is a bad idea, bad structure, bad performance. We have to ensure that you can fail without systemic consequences. So we have to make sure we understand the effects if we make deposit insurance permanent for every deposit, or if there are other structures in place where we can actually have a better understanding and better liquidity provision for institutions.
I want to ask you about the debt ceiling. President Biden has his proposal with a budget. We don't have the Republican budget just yet, but we are getting closer to the X date. You know this. Where's the response, and where are the negotiations right now?
Well, the negotiations started with the president meeting with the Speaker of the House for the first time a month and a half ago. There have been no additional meetings scheduled, no additional talks. The president released his budget last Thursday. Events have overtaken, obviously, and since then, and the focus has been a little different here in Washington. But we have to engage in serious negotiations between House Republicans and the White House. That's how it has to happen. I think we should get through this without drama. In light of the economic situation, in light of the constraints in our financial system, we have to get through this with as little drama as possible, and that's my motivation. We also have to address the fiscal house. Spending is up dramatically from pre-COVID, and we have conservatives that run the House of Representatives that want to address that fiscal question, and I think we should. But we also have to ensure the balance between what we can pass in the House with what the White House is willing to accept as well. It's a tricky negotiation, and frankly, until the president released his budget last Thursday, there were not serious talks. My hope is we get into those serious talks.
Mr. Chairman, thanks for your time today. I appreciate your answering all of our questions. Don't be a stranger here at the table. It sounds like we have some things to follow up on.
A few things. And
you have a lot of work cut up for you.
Well, and what a time to start a new show. A slow news week, nothing going on.
We thought we'd ease into it.
Yeah, I should have known when you're kicking this off that something was going to go haywire.
That's certainly right. What a time to start a show. Representative Patrick McHenry, chairman on the House Financial Services Committee, joining us a little bit earlier. Quickly, since we've had the first Republic news, he has said it's a welcomed news shoring up these financial institutions. And our thanks, of course, to Washington Bureau Chief Peggy Collins and executive editor Michael Shepard.
Coming up on Balance of Power, Special Presidential Coordinator for Global Infrastructure and Energy Security, Amos Hochstein. The view from the White House next on the impact on the banking turbulence on U.S. energy. It's still ahead on Balance of Power on Bloomberg.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Anne-Marie Hordern. Now, turbulence in the banking system bleeding over into the energy market, with PIMCO this morning warning the financial troubles may curb U.S. oil and gas production due to credit conditions and lower energy prices. Joining us now is Special Presidential Coordinator for Global Infrastructure and Energy Security, Amos Hochstein. Amos, thank you so much for joining us. What do you make of this? There obviously is turmoil in the financial sector. Are you concerned that's going to impact oil production?
Well, first, Anne-Marie, let me say it's great to be here on the new show, on your new first week of the new show, so it's really great to be here. Look, why don't we take this one day at a time? We've seen a decline in oil prices. We're seeing some crunch there, but I think we should take a deep breath and wait and see how this crisis right now impacts the oil and gas industry production and what the profile is so far. Prices have come down. We're watching it very closely. We'll continue to watch it over the next several days.
Yeah, prices right now, actually, WTI is trading at $68.35. You said we would refill the SPR when prices were around 70. Should we be expecting an announcement?
Well, I think that what we said was that around $70 is when we are still committed. Let me just start. We are still committed, the president's committed, as he said, to replenishing the SPR after the extraordinary draws last year. We remain that commitment stays intact. It doesn't happen from one day to the next. Oil prices go down. As you know, we don't just purchase oil into the SPR. There's a lot of machinations that go there. So we are looking at this very carefully. We're going to see how the prices continue and see where we are over the next several days and make decisions as they're appropriate. We would like usually to buy and replenish at a lower price, as we've sold on an average of above $90 a barrel. So we're going to be opportunistic. We're going to see what we can do, but it doesn't happen overnight.
How long does it take to initiate a sale then? How long would that bidding take, and how long will it take? How many years to refill the SPR after this drawdown?
So it's a great point. Nothing happens overnight. You have to decide that this is the right environment, so therefore you wait to see where the prices are going to be, are landing. And once we see that it's over a period of time, and then we have to put bids together. Those companies have to take those bids, and we would then have to make the purchases. So that takes time, and that's why you don't do it on the first day or the second day that an oil price is in decline, especially when it's not necessarily declining on fundamentals. So let's see how we look over the next short period of time, and we'll make decisions.
To be clear for our viewers, though, it would be a years-long process, right? Could you take advantage of lower prices and accelerate that?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but I think we would want it to. What we said was we would want to take advantage of lower prices to begin replenishing once we know that the lower prices are there, and they'll be there when we actually replenish. So we're going to take a look at it. We're studying it. We want to, after releasing 180 million barrels over a period of 6-7 months last year, we want to be in a position of replenishing, but we'll do it in the most responsible way possible.
Some of the major analysts on Wall Street were calling for triple-digit crude right now. And you have Brent also below $75 a barrel. You, I know, never saw the market in this way. So how do you see the market right now in terms of the China reopening, in terms of the price cap working? Where do you see prices going from here?
So as I did not get overly excited when I talked to you the last time about the pronouncements that we would be at over $100 a barrel, I'm not going to get too excited about some of the other pronouncements. I think we want to look at the fundamentals of where the market is. We look carefully at the China reopening. As you know, as you've been reporting, it's a very strong reopening in China since after COVID zero policy ended, but still not really on the oil side and on energy overall, not yet at that level of really expanding fast. So we have to continue to watch that. waiting to see what happens with aviation and as people start to traveling more, and that's specifically in Asia. We are traveling more in the West, not as much yet in the East. Those flights have not come back yet. So there's still some demand that has to be to see if it picks up or not. So I think that I thought prices were too high before. I thought prices were too high both at the oil side as well as at gasoline at the pump. I think we are at a place where they've maybe come off a little bit faster than I expected due to the news over the last several days. But I think we're at a much healthier place of supply and demand. Second half of the year, we're going to look at that and see where we are. As we did since before the war started and during the war, we are watching this carefully to make sure that the American economy and the global economy has the kind of energy prices that will allow for continued growth.
Just to ask you quickly about the Willow project that the president recently approved. I'm curious your thoughts on this, as the president has been urging oil companies to drill more. Is this good news for American consumers? What will it actually mean for them?
Well, I think what the president has said is two things. One, we must accelerate the energy transition. That is goal number one since the day he ran for office and came into office.
Assets.
And, well, what we want to do is to be able to accelerate the energy transition and rely more and more on clean energy versus fossil fuels. At the same time, we have to recognize that to have an energy transition, we need to have the supply there as we are going towards, as we take demand off. So we want to take demand off as much as possible, but we have to be responsible. And we know what happens when you do this irresponsibly. The Inflation Reduction Act is clearly the most important clean energy transition legislation in U.S. history, and that any country in the world has done. That is going to help us accelerate. We have now that legislation's passed, we have to implement it. But we also have to take some steps here and there to make sure that we have the supply that we need to run the current economy.
Amos, thank you for being here. Appreciate the insights. Special Presidential Coordinator for Global Infrastructure and Energy Security, Amos Hochstein. Coming up, First Republic Bank in trouble. We're going to talk to Senator Chris Van Hollen from the Banking Committee about what happened today. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Anne-Marie Hordern.
Joe, still to come on the program, Senator Chris Van Hollen, of course, of Maryland. He sits on the Senate Banking Committee, and we are going to be discussing, of course, First Republic banks bailing out banks today.
Big news today for sure.
That's coming up next on Balance of Power, right here on Bloomberg TV.
Here's what would make me feel more comfortable. If the Treasury, if the Federal Reserve came out and said, look, here was the problem, all right? Here's what we did wrong. Here's what we learned. We've checked all the other banks in the country, and we don't have that problem. They didn't say that. They just say the nice words that we don't have a problem. So what I want is information. As a depositor in a bank, I like to know, have you reviewed my bank?
Florida Senator Rick Scott looking for guidance in the wake of SVB's collapse and the rescue of First Republic. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV alongside Joe Matthew. I'm Amber Hodern. Joe, great interview with the senator. He wants more information, which is what I'm hearing from a lot of lawmakers.
Yep.
And also, it doesn't seem to be working. First Republic shares extend post-market decline to 29%.
Yeah, well, he's looking for more information. He's looking to the Fed to point a blaming finger, but interesting, I went through a lot with him. Woke bank, a lot of the lines that we've heard, lack of enforcement, and we're hearing more and more from lawmakers, like we did earlier from Patrick McHenry, that they're pulling off the blame game a little bit, and I wonder if it's because they're hearing a lot more scary stuff that we may not be privy to, that they realize this may not be as simple as it seemed on Monday.
Or potentially it's not polling so well, or people not really buying that that's what this is. For more information on all of this, Senator Chris Van Hollen, Democrat of Maryland, joins us now. Senator, thank you so much. I know you've had a tremendously busy day.
We know a lot of what happened now in the past 48 hours, 72 hours. The latest news we have is that Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, was at Janet Yellen's office this afternoon. Banks bailing out banks, this deal, really which seems to be orchestrated by the U.S. government. What can you tell us about what you've learned today and the phone calls you were getting?
Well, first of all, it's great to be with you. Congratulations on your show. Never a dull moment. Good timing. Look, I think that we've been actually very transparent about what's happened because you're reporting, of course, on the meeting that took place with Secretary Yellen. And I think the reports are very accurate that Secretary Yellen helped engineer this essential buyout by bigger banks of First Republic, which is a good news story, I think, for the system. That those banks were able to come together and make that move again at the request of Secretary Yellen. So I think Secretary Yellen in her testimony today, Senate Finance Committee, really laid out the facts as I understand them. I don't think there's any hidden story that the public doesn't know. Obviously, we're working very hard to try to detect any other weakness in the system. But so far, I think the emergency actions have been effective.
Senator, we spoke earlier this hour with Congressman Patrick McHenry, of course, chairs the Financial Services Committee. He issued a statement following this deal that says, "I'm glad to see this come together." I'm reading directly. "Without government intervention." Isn't this arrangement the definition of government intervention?
Well, I saw that comment. Yeah, it's true that Secretary Yellen helped facilitate this. No doubt about it. So the federal government was involved. I'm assuming that what Congressman McHenry was referring to is the fact that all the capital put into this deal with First Republic came from private banks, from the bigger banks. So in that sense, this was all private money. But yes, the federal government did help facilitate this because they are on full alert, trying to watch for any signs of contagion. And I think they have done a good job of tracking down, all those signals and acting very quickly.
Private money, maybe government time. Senator, what happens next? Who are you looking at in terms of, everyone wants to point fingers in terms of blame. Obviously, there needs to be an autopsy of all the information. But where do you really want to hear from? Who do you really want to hear from next, or what institution?
Well, we are going to have hearings in the Senate Banking and Housing Committee. Sherrod Brown, Senator Brown, is the chairman of that committee. I've conferred with him on a number of occasions in the last 24 hours. And I think the goals of those hearings would be twofold. One is do a postmortem. As you say, there are lots of theories going around as to exactly what happened here. But we need to gather the facts. That's number one. And then based on those facts, make decisions as to, what actions need to be taken to prevent this kind of failure going forward. Obviously, a big question has been whether there's going to be legislative action. I think it's too early to tell. There are measures that the Federal Reserve can take. In fact, the Federal Reserve was in the process of issuing a notice that they were going to develop more oversight, more measures to deal with risk, something I strongly supported. Interesting, a lot of my colleagues were giving the Federal Reserve lots of grief about their plans to move forward. That was at least before these two banks failed. So hopefully there'll be a change of tune there.
We spoke with Senator Sherrod Brown actually yesterday, Senator, and he was very much in favor of a legislative answer that would restore elements of Dodd-Frank, for instance, that were undone in 2018. Do you agree with him?
Well, I think it was a mistake to scale back Dodd-Frank to the extent it was. I certainly opposed the efforts to reduce oversight, the stringency oversight for banks the size of Silicon Valley Bank, $200 billion banks. The issue there was the community banks, around $50 billion, had some good arguments that the costs of the additional oversight and regulations would be overly burdensome on them. But the larger banks tried to piggyback not the super large banks, but banks the size of Silicon Valley Bank tried to piggyback on the community bank. So I oppose that legislation because I think it did open the door to more risk taking. But in terms of next steps, I really am looking for looking to the hearings to gather more information on where we go from here.
And Senator, what are you expecting next week from the Fed? Do you think this has potentially changed their course of action?
Well, as I indicated, the Fed had begun to move down the path toward greater oversight, putting in measures to detect risk taking. And Senator Brown and I actually wrote them a letter encouraging that they move forward. A lot of our colleagues on the Senate Banking Committee had been lambasting them for their plans to move ahead. As I said, I hope now, people will back off and let the Fed take measures that they think are necessary in order to better protect the banking system and consumers.
Yeah. Senator, thank you. Senator Chris Van Hollen, the Democrat from Maryland, with us today on Balance of Power. We appreciate your insights. How about we stop and take a breath here and get a look at how we got here and where this could go next? Bloomberg's Kayleigh Lyons with us for more on that. Hey, Kayleigh.
Hey, Joe. Well, obviously, how we got here is that we had a few major failures of regional banks, but still the second and third largest failures we had seen in U.S. banking history. And what that led to was a huge shift in migration in deposits outside of some of those regional lenders into the big guys, the ones deemed too big to fail and therefore backstopped, in theory, by the U.S. government. And we saw that evidenced once again today when we got data out of the Federal Reserve on the balance sheet and just took a look at the kind of access to Fed lending that banks have demanded over the course of the last week. $165 billion nearly over to facilities, including a record for their traditional backstop, liquidity backstop, the discount window. $152.85 billion. Not only is that a record, to put it in context, the week prior, it was $4.58 billion. So that just goes to show you the kind of funding and liquidity challenges that were ongoing in the banking system, at least through yesterday, which is in theory what this deal, the big banks lending confidence and credibility perhaps to a smaller lender by providing this liquidity, providing these deposits, shoring up confidence is supposed to achieve. But it does raise a question of the longer term implications here of how much people are going to trust their regional banks versus the ones deemed too big to fail. This is something we're hearing about in Janet Yellen's testimony in the Senate Finance Committee today. Senator James Langford, the Republican from Oklahoma, asked her, how do you make sure that there isn't a flight from deposits from community banks to the big banks? She really struggled with that answer. She said, that's not our intention. And he said, well, it's happening. And it just goes to show you the longer term difficulty here. We'll see what we see in the data when the Fed puts it out next week, now that this move has been made by the big banks providing this rescue to First Republic. But it just goes to show you the challenges that are out there in the banking system right now.
Yeah, and it's Kayleigh, it's not even individuals that are concerned. The market doesn't believe it. Banks bailing out banks and post-market decline of First Republic to 29%.
Well, I wonder how much that is a product of the fact that we don't necessarily know the terms of this agreement. From Bloomberg's reporting, we understand that they've committed to at least 120 days, but it raises a question of what happens with these $30 billion in uninsured deposits, mind you, at the end of that, and that there is still perhaps an ongoing ripple effect that could be felt from the failures of Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank. We've all been looking across the Atlantic at what is going on with Credit Suisse. There is still existing concern within the banking system. It's just a question of what actions are going to be enough to potentially actually stem the bleeding and prevent this crisis from extending any further. The market confidence is shaky at best, perhaps, on that front.
Yeah, market confidence and consumers. All right, Bloomberg's Kayleigh Lyons, thank you so much. Coming at the program, we'll talk about the banking sector a little bit more and the TikTok ban gaining traction in the United States with our political panel. That's coming up. This is Balance of Power.
What possible fate will become of our bank other than to diminish and fail?
I happen to know for a fact that won't happen.
Seriously? Why not?
Because
we'll start Signature. Yeah, Signature.
That was video we just saw from 2016 featuring Signature Bank's co-founder singing alongside employees a very different story today. I almost can't believe it. Joining us now to discuss is Steer PR partner Lauren Tomlinson and former Biden campaign Democratic strategist Kevin Walling. Guys, thank you so much for coming into the studio. First off, credit to Joe for digging up that video. Unbelievable.
A lot more where that came from, by the way.
But
they were making videos every other day like this.
But does that video play into what the Republicans are trying to say, that some of these banks were focused on and had different agendas? They weren't focused on core business, which is people's money. They were focused on things like TikTok videos.
Yeah, right. Listen, as a communications professional, obviously those have an important, part of a communications campaign. Like, right, you want to bring in your employees and have those types of things. But I do think that it raises the question of, how were they approaching their really serious responsibility to to provide for their investors, to make sure that the deposits were there when they needed it. And, I think the whole woke conversation is a little cute, right? And it's easy for, I think, lay people and for Republicans to kind of make the case to plain language to their constituencies, what they're looking at. But I think what they're really saying is we've got to take a real look at some of these smaller banks. We've been focusing on the big banks, the too big to fail banks. They're heavily regulated. They have a lot of stress tests, all those things. What are the local feds doing? And how are they looking at some of these smaller banks who obviously, carry a lot of weight in this economy right now?
Kevin, we've been talking to a lot of lawmakers over the last couple of days. Monday, it was blame game. It was lack of regulation. No, lack of enforcement. No, the Fed. As we've made our way through the week, we've started hearing a lot less of that, to the point where Democrats and Republicans on the program today are saying, hey, we need to figure out what happened first. What's leading to this realization? Are they hearing things that we don't know about?
Well, Joe, I think both parties have skin in the game with this, right, and are culpable to some degree in terms of some of this lax regulation. You saw that great interview that you just had with Patrick McHenry, the chair of the Financial Services Committee, who repeated multiple times that it was a bipartisan bill in 2018 with regards to banking oversight. So I think you see both parties have the skin in the game. It's a nice way to get out of an answer, right? We still need time to investigate what actually is happening before any legislation is proposed or any kind of legislative action takes place.
What happened with those 17 senators that voted to ease in 2018? Do you think this is going to come back to haunt him? I think of those that are up for re-election, like Senator Manchin.
It's a good question. We'll see what, and again, to Lauren's point earlier, these are complicated matters, right? So that Republicans use this woke kind of thing to capture all of their arguments under one notion. This is a really serious, complicated issue at hand that we'll see just 600 days from now what the appetite is with the American people if they're actually interested in this issue 600 days from now.
Sticking with the communications theme here, which is pretty important at the moment, Lauren, we heard from Janet Yellen today testifying on Capitol Hill. We really only heard from Joe Biden before the market opened on Monday. What else, if anything, should the White House, should the administration be doing to shore up confidence?
Yeah, I mean, they say that they have a plan, right, and that they've been executing on this plan. I think, again, like we've been saying, the plain language. I mean, a lot of this is, they're looking at macro trends, and they're trying to look at the economy as a whole and the trickle-down effect, right? But for the average American, they're like, oh, it sounded like a rich, tech bank, and I don't really understand what's going on, and did this impact me or did this not? I don't care. Am I getting paid on Friday? Okay, cool. So, I think they have a responsibility to really take these arguments down from a very academic, economic perspective and really plain language. What does this mean for average people? Why are they doing this? Is it going to affect, is the taxpayer bailing people out? Yeah. That's a real question because they're like, well, I don't want to pay more taxes. I mean, I just saw your budget plan. That's kind of crazy. So, there's a lot of things like that where I think that there's real opportunities for messaging that they could take advantage of.
Lauren and Kevin, stay with us again after the break. Coming up, we're going to talk about this new released video of a Russian fighter jet. Have you seen this colliding with an American drone and the geopolitical implications of that encounter with our panel? This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. I'm Joe Matthew, along with Anne-Marie Hordern. Our panel, Lauren and Kevin, are still with us as we look at this new video. It was released earlier today. You might have seen it by the U.S. military of a Russian fighter jet, an Su-27, releasing fuel, a fuel dump right in front of an American drone, trying to down the thing into the Black Sea. It did cause it to crash, creating further tension, of course, between the U.S. and Russia. Now, we know that this is nothing new, these types of intercepts when it comes to Russia. This goes back to the Cold War. This one actually damaged American hardware. And we have a story here on the terminal, actually. General Mark Milley is not calling this an act of war. Kevin, what should we call it?
It's certainly an escalation of force, as we're seeing. And Joe, it's a great point. We've seen this go on for the last 40 years over the Black Sea. But these interdictions are coming with more rapid speed as these Russians now claim more and more of the international airspace, right, from Crimea into their special military incursion into Ukraine. I think I'm actually heartened by this incident in that at least we're now back on the hotline to the Russians. We've not been speaking to them since October. General Milley, to your point in the question, had a phone conversation with his counterpart, same with General Austin, Secretary Austin. That is a positive sign to some degree that we're having those conversations, but it's certainly an escalation that needs to have some semblance of a response from this administration.
Yeah, Shoigu and Austin getting on the phone. A lot of people think, okay, at least there's communication. When you look at the politics of this, it's kind of fascinating how the Republicans, because if I talked to, say, Senator McConnell, he'd look at this and he'd say, we actually should be harsher on Russia. But then obviously you heard what Governor DeSantis had to say. How are they going to work around this messaging going into 2024?
I think that you're going to see kind of a split in the party between the isolationists, right, like the DeSantis and Trump, and then, because I'm just going down the presidential field right now, right, like that gave statements to Tucker Carlson yesterday. So we have DeSantis and Trump that are, more of the isolationist field, more of the why are we spending this money on Ukraine, right? That's their whole premise. Then you have Nikki Haley, Mike Pence, a lot of the more mainstream, I guess, like Republicans or the hawkish Republicans who are saying that, Ukraine is a vital interest, right? That we have to stand up to Russian aggression because if we don't put our foot down here, what does that say to China? What does that say to Iran? I mean, we're going to have a trickle effect if the U.S. does not take a strong stance on the global stage.
The two most likely candidates, though, the two most likely nominees, the Republican nomination.
Right now.
If you look at the
polls.
Right
now, absolutely. Ron DeSantis calls it a border dispute. We know what Donald Trump says about it. But how could you say a border dispute watching thousands of civilians die over the last year here? I mean, that's not a talking point that's going to resonate with the Republican establishment, is it?
No, I don't think it is. And I don't think most importantly, it's not going to resonate with the national security community. And I think that's where he really loses people, because every man or woman with a uniform on knows how important it is for America to maintain a very strong stance on the global stage in defense of democracy and in defense of our allies. And I think that's where actually he's going to lose a lot of people. And I think that there is a real conversation to be had about the U.S. spending, right? This is kind of where it's all going back to, that how much money are we giving to our allies? How much money are we spending abroad? How much money are we spending on defense? But those conversations, that debate, that needs to be happening in our Congress with, over budget issues, right? It doesn't need to be happening over our debt ceiling, and it doesn't need to be happening over the Ukrainian war.
Bringing up this video again, it's a Russian fighter jet colliding with a U.S. surveillance drone. I mean, the U.S. releasing this politically also potentially is useful. Does this not just say to the DeSantis who think this is a territorial dispute, well, actually, no, what Russia is doing is reckless on U.S. military hardware?
It's a really good point, Anne-Marie. And I think you're seeing this administration do more of that in terms of releasing this classified material so early in the process. We saw it with Ukraine. We saw it even with issues with China and Taiwan. So this administration has made this calculation to put that information out there because it totally debunks the Russian statements that are out there about this incident.
Russia says it never happened.
Exactly. And you now have the proof, the multiple videos of this plane not just dropping that fuel, but also colliding with one of the propellers. But I think to your original point, Anne-Marie, you see this divide within the Republican Party. You have 50% of registered Republicans that now question not just our support of the Ukraine people, but also the timelines, budgeting, things like that. And you see that divide play out. And the parties have almost flipped on this, right? Where would Ronald Reagan be right now if he were alive, right? He would be with Joe Biden and not a Ron DeSantis.
It's true. All right, our thanks to our panel, Steer PR partner Lauren Tomlinson and former Biden campaign Democratic strategist Kevin Walling. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter. All these stories will be on there on the terminal and online. Thanks for joining us. Coming up tomorrow, we'll be speaking with Representative Debbie Dingell of Michigan.
This is Bloomberg. We'll see you then.